Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 most disappointing cards from the Knights of the Frozen Throne. And when I say disappointing, what I mean is essentially cards that people had really high expectations for coming into the release of the expansion, but in fact turned out to not be that strong after all. In other words, these are cards that were overrated by myself and by the community at large. And this list is not just cards that I personally overrated. I actually went back to some of the pre-release polls that were put out there to the community to see which cards people had the highest expectations for, and then went through that list and picked out any of the cards that looked particularly disappointing so far, confirmed my suspicions using data from hsreplay.net, and put together the list you're going to see here just in a second. So let's go ahead and jump into that list, the 5 most disappointing cards from Frozen Throne. Up first is Valeera The Holo, a card that both I and the Hearthstone community rated pretty highly on average. I thought that although this looked like it had some weaknesses, would find some sort of home in a combo style deck where it enabled you to do some crazy shenanigans, but thus far in standard format that really hasn't shown up. There have been people playing this card and finding a little bit of success with it from time to time in constructed format, but when you look at the entire statistics across the standard format set, you realize this card's not very good. It's only got a 45% win rate in decks that play it, and it only has a 45% win rate when it's played, and in Hearthstone a 45% win rate just doesn't cut it. It looks like Valeera The Holo is just far too situational and a little bit too slow to work in Hearthstone as we see it today. Up next is another Rogue card, Shadowblade. Now, I don't mean to be taking punches at Rogue. Rogue is in a little bit of a tough spot right now in the meta. It's certainly no Quest Rogue era right now in Hearthstone. Rogue is struggling, but even though that's the case, and there might be people out there saying you can't just say these cards are bad because the class is bad, with a card like Shadowblade and Valeera, those are the kinds of cards that you would expect to be good enough to propel the class higher, to help it find success. And since these cards are failing to do so and still have pretty miserable win rates in and of themselves, well, that's a good sign that it's not just the class that's problematic. These cards aren't good enough either. And for Shadowblade, it only has a 45% win rate when the card is played, which unfortunately, again, in Hearthstone just isn't enough to make the cut. Shadowblade is not doing the things that Rogue needs it to do to pull Rogue out of the basement, which means Shadowblade is disappointing because a lot of us thought it was going to be that strong. I thought this was going to be a class-defining card that gave Rogue, across a variety of archetypes, a great tool to make it a successful class. I thought Valeera would be a situational tool to make a deck work, and in both of those cases, these cards have explicitly disappointed me because they did not accomplish that goal. Rogue is having trouble. These cards just aren't good enough to make the class relevant. Up next is another card that you could blame its class on for its lack of success almost as much as the card itself, because it is Professor Putricide. Hunter isn't the best class in the game right now, although it is gaining a little bit of popularity and gaining a little steam in the meta, it seems like, basically right now over the last couple days. So who knows, maybe there's a chance for Hunter after all, but Professor Putricide does not look like he's going to be a part of that equation. This card is incredibly unpopular right now. It's in only 0.3% of Hearthstone decks. Pretty much everybody has given up on Professor Putricide, which says a lot because a ton of people loved this card. People were singing Putricide's praises across the board. Everybody thought this was going to be strong enough to make a Secret Hunter kind of deck a thing. If I may brag a little bit, I was somebody who said, hold up, it doesn't look that good to me. I think I gave this 2 stars in my rating, and it maybe isn't even a 2-star card. It might actually be a 1-star card after all. I just think Professor Putricide, a little bit too situational, too hard to work with. Even the upside is not that high, and Secret Hunter is just a weird way to build Hunters still to this day. Even with Cloaked Huntress, you just have to high roll to make any success out of that deck, and more often than not, you don't high roll, so the deck tends to fail. Now, Putricide does have slightly higher win rates than other cards on this list at 48.7% if decks he's in and 47.4% when played, but still, that's not good enough, and this is not the kind of class-defining, archetype-defining card that people were expecting it to be. So even though that win rate isn't absolutely abysmal, it's still not a high-tier kind of win rate by any means. It's a losing win rate, and it's certainly far less than anybody expected for Professor Putricide, who was widely regarded as one of the defining cards in the set, and instead is one of the most forgettable cards in the set. And then moving on to the fourth card, it is Shaman's Voodoo Hexer. This is one I was really high on. I thought this was going to be a fantastic card. It looks a lot like Warrior's Ally Armorsmith, for instance, but arguably the freeze effect could be even better than the armor you gain from Ally Armorsmith. But as it turns out, this card just hasn't found a home in any sort of Shaman deck. Of course, Shaman is also dwindling in popularity in the Frozen Throne era. So when you add those two things together, Voodoo Hexer is only being played in 0.1% of Hearthstone decks, which is just incredibly low, disastrously low. And I wasn't the only person who thought Voodoo Hexer was going to be a strong card. This was one of the top 10 or 15 rated cards amongst the Hearthstone community, so everybody thought this one was going to be pretty solid. I still think fundamentally it's a fine card that could see play in the future, but it's not nearly good enough to carry a control Shaman archetype like I thought it might be. Certainly Freeze Shaman didn't take off. Not many people were expecting that to be the case, so that's not a huge surprise or a big disappointment there. But it just seemed like this card had enough average utility and enough defensive nature in it that it could still find a home in a Shaman deck. Unfortunately, it has not, and its win rate is one of the worst in the entire set. Decks it's played in only win 40.9% of their games, and when you play this card, the win rate actually drops to 39%, meaning Voodoo Hexer is one of the most disappointing cards in the set. And then finally, this one saddens me a little bit, but the last card on my list is Arthas, the neutral legendary minion. It might be the cutest card in Hearthstone, or the funniest, or the memeiest, I'm not really sure, but it's certainly not one of the best. And although I didn't think this card would be great, a lot of the community at large did. This was one of the highest rated legendaries in the set outside of the top 3 or 4 Death Knights. And unfortunately, this card is pretty much unplayable at this point. It's only in 1.2% of decks. Its win rates hover around 46% for both the decks it's in, also when it's played. As it turns out, Arthas is just too slow as a 2/2 body on turn 4. That's not enough for the cost. You just don't get any stats. And then that Death Rattle, as it turns out, not that strong either. Some of the Death Knight cards are really awkward to use or don't fit the decks that you get them in. And since you're only getting one with Arthas, and there's no upside attached to it like there is with the Lich King, where you get multiple instances of the card, or just the big 8/8 body with Taunt, Arthas is far worse than the Lich King. Doesn't even make really any sense in Death Rattle decks. I mean, sure, there's been people out there who've played this card and had some fun with it, and probably have won some games with it too, but it's not because of this card that you're winning games. It might in fact even be in spite of this card that you're winning games if you have found success with Arthas. It looks like this is actually one of the weakest legendaries in the set, and that's a real shame because it is incredibly cute. If this was a 3/3 though, I bet Arthas would see a ton more play. Of course, that will never happen, but that's what it will take to make this card good. As it stands right now, Arthas is a bad dog. So there you go, guys. That's it for my 5 most disappointing cards. So all that said, if you guys have any thoughts, comments, questions on this list, of course, please leave them in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.